Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Jacklyn St. I'm a psychotherapist here in Ottawa, Ontario. I'm also a PhD candidate with Temple University. My research focus on female survivors of sexual abuse who self-identify as being hypersexual. I'm a part-time teacher also at Temple University. I'm a clinician, a clinical supervisor, I should say, as well. And I'm also the wellness director for an organization called Canadian Women of Color Leadership Network. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and welcome to the Racialized in Healthcare podcast. So today's podcast will focus on strategies for coping with with work-related stress, which is really something to discuss within the Black community. So we'll get started. Our first question is: what is work-related mental health stress, and what does it look like?
So thank you, Mary, for your question. It's a very big question, but I'm not somebody that goes into organization and look at the environment and the workplace. I can't speak to that, but I am a Black woman working within a Black mental health organization called Le Centre Le CAMH here in Ottawa. I'm a Black teacher, I'm a Black psychotherapist, I'm a Black PhD student, I'm a Black clinical supervisor. So you might notice that I'm emphasizing maybe a little bit too much on the word Black, but when people see me, that's what they register for. Right, that I'm a Black woman. So, and afterwards there's stereotypes that kicks in, and then there's feeling about Black people that kicks in, and then depending on their relationship and how they feel, then maybe they're going to approach me and have a conversation. So I'm going to talk about work-related mental stress from my own experience, from what I have heard, and also from the different research and presentation that I've been doing in the past 2 years when it comes to our racialized communities and mental health. So I will present this theme on. I will present it to you with a theme of this safe space when it comes to work-related mental stress.
Yeah.
And as we go through this podcast, my reflective question to you is: do you feel safe in your work environment? And if the answer is no, then maybe this podcast is directed to you. And then at the end, I will mention a few places where you can go and seek help if you're from the Ottawa region. So to answer your question, Mary, let's define mental health. I will give you a very broad definition, and then we can explore it together throughout this podcast. So according to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities. He can cope with the normal stresses of life. He can work productively and fruitfully, and he's able to make a contribution to his or her community. So this very large definition talk about mental health. So in other words, when you go to work, how is your state of mind? How's your mental state? And when you leave work, how do you feel as well? So for example, do you feel validated in your work? Do you feel overwhelmed in your work? Do you feel like you can approach your boss or colleagues to share how you truly feel? Do you feel anxious when you go to work and during work? Do you feel like crying when you're at work? Do you feel like you are part of the team, or do you feel like left out? Do you feel like your voice counts? Do you feel that you're heard? Do you feel like you have to pretend to be someone else to be liked or heard? These are all a few indicators that maybe something is going on in your workplace, and it needs to change. And we haven't touched racism, racial discrimination, sexism, microaggression, and COVID. This is just your everyday. How do you feel at work? But keep them in mind and take a minute and really explore how do you feel when you go into your work and when you leave.
Yeah.
And all of these can have an impact on your state of mind. so it can have an impact on your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And also keep in mind that everybody is different. So I
Mm-hmm.
encourage everyone to seek help from a professional when needed, your community center, your crisis line, or just a friend.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You highlighted a lot of good points about, first of all, understanding is this a safe work environment before diving in. So, like, including like, okay, how do I deal with, discrimination in the workplace? How do I deal with sexism in the workplace? Those are all like really, really. Thank you. My next question is, what are some factors that can bring about work-related mental stress? And then a follow-up question is, what types of work environments bring about work-related mental stress?
Mhm. Yeah, so since I wanted to talk more about our racialized communities, my example will be based on that. And a few
Okay.
factors, like I just mentioned, are racism, systemic racism, racial discrimination, microaggression in the workplace. So, for example, offensive comments about someone's ethnicity, hair, food, or the way they talk.
Mm-hmm.
Another example can be getting a pass for promotion or only getting the projects that are related to diversity
Yeah.
or being the only racialized person at a meeting, and that's if you're accepted in that meeting and you got the invitation for that meeting. So all those elements is called culture tax, which means racialized and black people are given more work, less validation for the work they are doing, and every time the organization needs someone to represent the organization's diversity, well, then they will ask a racialized or a black person to do a presentation, for example, right? So Black History Month is coming up,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So is your organization just giving you validation and seeking your help because it's Black History Month, or because you actually have the competence that they're looking for to actually add on and to help the organization, right? So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes organizations are going to add that culture tax that I'm mentioning. So it's extra work, and you're not getting paid for that extra work, right? And it's extra
Yeah.
work related to diversity because you're part of that diversity, right? So as for the workplace environment, so a few questions to keep in mind. Do you have diversity at your workplace? Be mindful at the aesthetics of the organization. So what I mean by that, the pictures that you put on your wall, right? Do they reflect diversity? Um, for example, sometimes you walk into an organization and you have everybody that exceeded excellency, right?
Yes.
So you have diversity on that board, right? And that also shows the history of your company. So is it a company that welcomes diversity? Look at your politics, your hiring tactics, your annual
Mm-hmm.
report, your participate. You look at the complaints that you're getting, right? You have diversity training in your organization, and do you create the space to celebrate diversity, or is it just specifically for Black History Month or Black Mental Health Week, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the rest of the year, you don't talk about diversity, right? So that doesn't really create a safe space
Yes.
to
Yes.
open up and to talk.
For sure. That's so true. Um. So the next question is it's kind of builds up on what you have mentioned about creating a safe space whereby racialized workers,
Mhm.
employees feel like truly feel included and being very intentional about it. My next
Mhm.
question is, what are some impacts of work? And you touched upon this, but if you want to further elaborate, what are some impacts of work-related mental stress on, of course, employees? And does work-related mental health stress have a racialized profile focusing on Black Canadians?
And the answer is yes, absolutely. It has a racial profile focusing on Black comedians. Last year, I gave a conference regarding resilience of racialized group as well. Just to keep it in mind because
Mm-hmm.
it does have a huge impact. And I kind of divided. I'm going to give you three different themes
Okay.
that I will um, that will help you guys a little bit navigate on the impact that it can have on your mental health. So the first one is the emotional load, right? When we talk about racism and racial discrimination. So emotional load is seeing and hearing and living through racism every day. So we're both witness and victim at the same time, right? So I'm a Black woman. I am a victim of racism, sexism, and discrimination. But I also have some colleagues who are also Black, and sometimes you hear racial comments and sexism towards my colleague, right? So I'm a victim and a witness at the same time, and that has an impact on my mental health. So that's the first one. Second one is the loss of our identity. And what I mean by that is because Black and racialized people, even in Canada, it is seen as a problem. Like our skin color or pigmentation is seen as a problem, or it's seen as companies are taking a risk by having us in their company, right? So then it begs the question, well, okay, well, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I seen as a risk, right? And this is based on colonialism and things like that we need to deconstruct, right? So what we're going to do, we've learned, racialized and Black people, we've learned to be very good at code switching, right? So it means that changing who we are to fit in. So we're suppressing everything that our Blackness, you know, for others to feel safe around us, which I think is problematic, right? So why are we changing for other people to feel safe when other people should learn their history and the truth about their history, and they should learn to respect us, right? And then the last one is racial burden. So every time we step out of our house, we prepare ourselves for the possible of microaggressions or racial discrimination. We become hyper vigilant about our surroundings when we're in the car, in the bus, at the workplace, at the cafeteria, when we eat, right? So this touching the whole concept of living while Black, for example, right? And research is showing that our communities are suffering from that. The level of anxiety and depression are up. And it's one thing to have resilience, but we've tried to fit in so much that we're losing ourselves, our values. We're losing our racial identity. And, and I remember doing that as well, that, I remember that being a Black woman wasn't safe for me. So I suppressed all of my Blackness to make sure that I could fit in and, to feel safe. I am doing a presentation on the impact of losing a racial identity because of racism and discrimination. And it's going to be on February 7 at 11 in collaboration with the VTRAC Lab at Ottawa U, under the supervision of Dr. Jacklyn St. And the presentation actually talks about suicide prevention in our Black community. So, and it's going to be in French, but if people want to join in and listen to that talk, I'm actually going to go a little bit deeper on the loss of our racial identity. And right now, I would like to share you guys a quote by an author that I really like, and her name is Vina Walker. And the book, one of the books that she wrote is called the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. So that's a good resource to have because it really it helps you to understand anxiety, depression, but with a Black lens, right? In her book, she mentions, imagine your communities as one where children are nurtured by teachers, where Black kids are inspired to explore science with their boldest imagination. Your young adult brother or sister doesn't give a second thought to the police lights behind his rearview mirror, where family members can go get checked by the doctors and get the same treatment, same smile and care. Imagine a world where your cousin can run for office fairly and not just for a diversity position. Imagine that every time your partner walks out that door, You no longer have to hold your breath until he comes back safe at home, because violence against Black people is everywhere, and your partner, your kid could be the next person. He could be the next target. Imagine such a world for your kids and grandkids, right? I really like that quote because it sounds so surreal and almost imaginable to attend. Um, but this is what we're seeking. And what she's saying is that we want to be respected at the same level as anybody else, right? Why is it that we cannot have that world? Why is it that we have to imagine that world and it's not reality, right? So imagine if you, for all the organizations out there, imagine if you could actually create that safe space, that type of world in your organization for Black people.
Wow, that is very powerful. Thank you for that. I completely agree with you. And I also want to thank you for being vulnerable, because code switching is something that I'm also guilty of doing as well. So yes, thank you. And then thank you for that. And I'll have the links posted for your event on February 7th, as well as the book on a project Play Black, and the impact on mental health. I'll also post that as well within this podcast. So moving further deeper, work mental health stress can have more of an impact when financial constraints come in, because that can also play key role in, if now I have to leave my Blackness behind and code switch and to fit into like this space. As well as particularly when an individual depends on a job to support themselves and their loved ones. In your experience working within the mental health field, how do individuals generally respond to work-related mental health stress, given like financial constraints?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak on more of a clinical point of view of what I'm seeing when I work with clients, and also the research and the presentations that I've done in the past. So when it comes to our communities, we tend to minimize our stress or emotions. And sometimes it's not that we don't pay attention to it, but we're so focused on surviving that we put our emotions aside, right? And a few reasons for that can be because we're afraid of losing our jobs.
Yeah.
We already have to work twice as hard at our work. We're the first ones to get fired. We're the last ones to get promoted. You know that if you do get a promotion, and there's a few stereotypes as well that doesn't help, right? So when we talk about the strong Black woman, right, we're supposed to be strong. And what does that mean to be strong? Well, it means that you're supposed to be able to do everything and not complain. Yep. Right, so that also has an impact on how we're going to deal with our stress and our emotions. And there's also the stereotypes, especially in the healthcare system, that Black people and racialized people have a higher tolerance for pain as well, which doesn't help, right? So research is showing that we're not giving the same level of attention when we go to the hospital and we seek help, for example. I've already mentioned the fear of losing our jobs. Also, when we look at the history of mental health campaigns, and even I'm a PhD student, I did an undergrad, I went to college, I have my master's in the mental health field, and there was no racialized people on the covers. When we talk about mental health, Becos Polacos, for example, there's no Black people on the covers, right? So it makes it seem like mental health issues is not part of our everyday life when it is.
Yeah.
And also in the research, the Ottawa Public Health did a report specifically for the Black communities, and that report was officially done and released in 2020. And that's the first report that they went out and did interviews with the Black community. So that's another example of, well, we've been here all along. And we've been saying that there's an issue, but nobody's been listening to us, right? So, sorry. And when you look at the relationship between science and Black people, it has never been a good relationship, right? We've been dehumanized. We've been seen as less of a person. We can just go back and look at the Tuskegee method study, right? We can look at just how Black people, Black women, Black men, and Black children were treated when in the name of science, right? So these are all elements that has an impact on the reason why we distrust the mental health care system, and also why the mental health care system also has a distrust towards us.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I definitely, yeah. And it's even more interesting considering that we as Black people need those mental health services a lot more, considering like the different ways we interact with like the colonial system that still is modified and still exists. So moving further, taking into account the importance of employment, what strategies pertaining to coping with work-related mental stressors, particularly for Black newcomers and Black people of African descent in Canada?
So there's two different strategies here that I want to point out. So the first one is the strategies that you have in place in the organization that needs to look at their policies, right?
Yeah.
And if you read the book of Ibrahim Kandi, which is called How to Be Anti-Racist, he talks a lot about racist policies and how we have to change them within our organization, within our workplace, to include more diversity and creating that safe space that I was talking about. So this is for the organization, but then you have yourself, right? What can you do? What kind of strategies you can put in place for yourself that better help your mental health. So, we know that in our culture there's a culture of silence when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
In a lot of families, it's still taboo. We're not having those conversations. So where can you go that you feel safe, that you can talk about your emotions and how you feel? So maybe seek a friend, talk with your friends, maybe you have a relative that you feel closer to that you can talk to. Maybe it's within your community center or where you do volunteer work or some organization that you're part of.
Yeah.
Like a book club, for example, or a dance club, if that's what you like, or I don't know, video games that you like, So create a space where you can have discussion on your mental health, right? And do a scan of yourself of how are you feeling today, right? Are you sad? Are you happy? Are you angry? Are you frustrated? And look for some symptoms. For example, we all know when it's exam time, some of us will eat more. I know I'm one of those people, when it comes to exam, I eat more. Lack of sleep, or you get migraine, you get back pain and neck pain. You're more, you start forgetting stuff. You cry for no reasons. These are all indicators that, okay, my balance is off. My state of mind is off. So what can you do? Is it mindfulness? Is it seeking a professional? Is it going to your pastor? So it's looking for things that works for you, right? It's what works for you first, and acknowledge that there's something wrong, accept that there's something wrong, and then we can work towards, okay, what can we do about how you're feeling? What can we do with that pain, for example?
Yes, I completely agree. Importantly, accepting and acknowledging that something is wrong. That is a huge gap that we need to cross over, because it's okay to feel sad. Because we're human. It's we need to have that permission to feel. Okay, so moving forward, in an event where an individual is afraid to advocate for themselves at work, but is experiencing work-related mental health stress, and leaving is not an option, How does one navigate such an environment?
Mm-hmm. This comes back to, it reminds me a bit, we're so used to, before we leave the house, we hold our breath until we come back home where it feels safe, and that's if home is safe for you, right? Because we know that there's so many possibilities for microaggression and all of that. So it's not just for your workplace and your work environment, but how can you put strategies into place on an everyday basis so you feel safe? When you drive, what strategies you could put into place that you feel safe while driving?
Okay.
When you go to the grocery store, what strategies that you can put in so that way you can feel safe, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And some people may think, well, it's not fair. Like, there's a lot of work that Black people need to do. Yes, and there's also a lot of work that the rest of the population also needs to do. But sometimes you have to think about yourself first, so that we can help the other person as well. So a few strategies in your workplace. If you work in an office that you're by yourself, put some decorations or stuff like that that you like, that makes you feel comfortable, right? And if you have one person that you feel safe enough to talk to, then go and talk to that person, right? Look at your policies, right? Do your research about the organization that you're going to get yourself involved in. What are their values? What are their mission? What they say on paper versus what you experience at work is two completely different things, right?
Yes, yeah.
So take the time to actually read their policies. Take the time to actually read what happens if you want to make a complaint. Is there somebody who is responsible for those complaints? Look at the pictures that are on the wall when you go for the interview. Look at how, take a moment to feel the energy in the room. Look at how you're greeted before the interview. Who is greeting you and how is she greeting you? I remember I went for interviews, and my name is Jacklyn, so it's not like it's a very generic name, right? And I'm Black. So when I walked into an interview one time, the person saw my name and my CV, and then she looked at me. I could see the element of surprise in her face, right? So in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, what does that element of surprise mean? Is it positive? Is it negative? And listening to some of the questions that they ask you and how you're treated during that interview, and sometimes you can sense the possible microaggression. So then you kind of know, well, okay, is this going to be a safe environment? And when you wait in the waiting area, is there any other people that looks like you in the waiting area? And when you look at the employees, is there any other employees that look like you, right? So it goes back to creating a safe space and to looking at, okay, what is the history of that organization, right? Is this a safe space for me? Are they open to change, for example?
Yep, that is true. That's true. So my last and final question before we end today's podcast. Therapy is a luxury that not everyone can afford. What is an alternative? What are other alternatives that an individual can look to with regards to coping with work-related mental health stress? I know you discussed. Yes.
Yeah, so it's true that seeking in private therapy is expensive, but there's also communities that are specific that work specifically with racialized and Black people. So, for example, here in Ottawa, we have the Ottawa Black Coalition, right? So you can reach out to them, and they can find you support. I also mentioned that I'm part of the Canadian Women of Color Leadership Network, right? And we do have a support group that is hiding and building with that organization. So you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and be part of our community and be part of the discussions that we have on mental health. Self-help books, I've mentioned one, Rita Walker, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health.
Mm-hmm.
And reading is very important, but also learn your history, right? Build your identity. For us to feel more confident and to make change, we also need to know where we stand,
Yes. Yeah.
what we understand from ourselves, what we understand from history, and how the history had an impact on you, on us, on generations and generations of people. And by understanding, we can help change the narratives for it to be positive, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because if we don't do it, if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to do it for you. And they're not going to do a good job at it, right? Because when you look at history books, we're not in the history books, right? So it's time for us to talk, to tell our story so we can change that narrative and we can start owning our truth and our history, right? If you're a student, look at your associations. What do you have in your college or your university? Ottawa U has the VTRAC lab that focuses specifically on Black mental health. There's Counseling Connect as well, which is a crisis line for Black and racialized people. If you go on the website of Somerset West, they actually have a list of resources for ECB communities as well. It's more related to resources in Ottawa.
Okay.
But I did find a list of resources for Toronto, and I sent it to you via email. So if people reach out, you can always send them that list. I haven't checked it though, I haven't had time to actually call all of the places to see if the numbers and everything is still accurate, but it's a place to start.
Thank you so much, Jacklyn. This concludes our podcast. Thank you so much, for sharing your thoughts, for being vulnerable. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. This was fun. Let's do it sometime.
Awesome.